Every name you were taught to worship in school: Pythagoras, Homer, Shakespeare, history's greatest minds. What if I told you 7 of them never actually existed? Every child in the Western world memorizes the Pythagorean theorem. Every military commander studies Sun Tzu before commanding a single soldier. Every literature student reads Shakespeare before earning a diploma. These are the names entire education systems are built upon. But 7 of the most celebrated figures in all of human history share one deeply unsettling secret. The scholarly evidence doesn't suggest they were merely exaggerated over centuries or romanticized through retelling. It suggests they were deliberately manufactured, invented from scratch by institutions that desperately needed a founding figure to survive. A cult needed a divine leader to justify its doctrine. A civilization needed a poet to anchor its identity. A military tradition needed a strategist to project power. In every single case, the same mechanism produced the same result. Centuries of collective human achievement were collapsed into one convenient name. What follows is not a list of historical footnotes. It is a blueprint for how history gets fabricated, and the blueprint is frighteningly identical every time it appears. Start with the name every middle schooler knows: Pythagoras, the father of geometry. The man behind the theorem you memorized, probably despised, and never forgot. Here is what your teacher never mentioned. Pythagoras never wrote a single word. Not one sentence. Not one equation. Not one fragment of text in his own hand has ever been discovered. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy confirms this directly. Every single thing we believe about Pythagoras comes from people who lived centuries after he supposedly died. His followers, the Pythagoreans, were not casual fans. They were a secretive religious cult operating out of Croton, in what is now southern Italy. Members took 5-year vows of complete silence. New initiates weren't even permitted to lay eyes on Pythagoras for the first 5 years of membership. They believed he possessed a golden thigh. They claimed he was the literal son of the god Apollo. They swore he could be in 2 places simultaneously and hold conversations with animals. And here is the detail that should genuinely stop you cold. Every single discovery ever attributed to Pythagoras was credited to him by these followers, not by him. Their internal rule was ironclad. All knowledge belonged to the master. If you made a mathematical breakthrough inside the cult, it became his. Your name was erased. His grew larger. Alberto Martinez, in his 2012 book The Cult of Pythagoras, argues there is virtually no credible evidence that Pythagoras contributed anything whatsoever to mathematics or science. The theorem bearing his name was already known to Babylonian mathematicians more than 1,000 years before he supposedly walked the earth. The Plimpton 322 clay tablet, dated to approximately 1800 BC, proves this conclusively. It sits in the Columbia University collection right now. You can look it up today. The Babylonians were calculating right triangles 12 full centuries before the man who received all the credit was supposedly even born. So what was Pythagoras, really? Possibly a charismatic cult leader. Possibly a composite figure assembled by his followers to legitimize their unusual beliefs. Possibly no one at all. The cult needed a divine founder. The more supernatural the leader, the more unquestionable the teachings became. It is worth noting that both Aristotle and Plato referenced the Pythagoreans as a group, a collective. Neither one ever claimed to have verified Pythagoras as a real, individual human being. Even the greatest philosophers of antiquity treated this as an organization, not a biography. And that exact mechanism, a group inventing its own genius, is about to repeat 6 more times. Homer, the greatest poet in Western history, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the 2 works that defined and anchored Greek literary civilization for millennia. For someone so monumentally influential, there are 0 contemporary accounts of his life. None. 7 different ancient cities claim to be his birthplace, which is simply a polite way of acknowledging that nobody actually knew where he came from. He is traditionally described as blind, yet no source from his own era confirms even that. Scholars began questioning Homer's existence as far back as the 3rd century BC. In 1795, Friedrich August Wolff formally argued that the Iliad and Odyssey were assembled from oral traditions created by many different authors across many centuries. The linguistic evidence is unambiguous. The texts contain vocabulary and grammatical structures from entirely different historical periods, layered on top of one another. That is not what a single author produces. That is what a living, evolving tradition produces, and then someone gives it a name. Greek civilization needed a founding literary genius. A vast oral tradition spanning generations needed a face. So they gave it one. They called him Homer. And nobody questioned it again. 1,000 ships launched by a poem that cannot be traced to a single human hand. Now consider Sun Tzu, the most celebrated military strategist who ever lived. The Art of War is required reading at West Point. It has been translated into dozens of languages. CEOs quote it in boardrooms every single day. And yet Columbia University's Asia for Educators program states it plainly. There is no firm evidence that Sun Tzu existed. The name Sun Wu does not appear in any written text prior to Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, written around 94 BC, roughly 400 years after Sun Tzu supposedly lived and fought. The most exhaustive historical text covering that precise period, the Zhuizhuan, mentions virtually every notable figure of that era. It does not mention Sun Tzu. Not once. Song dynasty scholar Yisher first noticed this glaring discrepancy around 1150 AD. He found it peculiar that the most comprehensive chronicle of an era could simply omit its supposed greatest military mind. The name Sun Wu itself may not even be a personal name at all. Some scholars translate it as a descriptive title meaning the fugitive warrior. In 1972, an archaeological discovery complicated things further. The Yingxian bamboo slips, found in tombs sealed between 134 and 118 BC, contain 2 separate military texts, one attributed to Sun Tzu and another to Sun Bin, a later figure who appears to have genuinely existed. Scholars now describe these as a single, continuously evolving intellectual tradition, unified under the Sun name. Generations of military thinkers built a body of knowledge over centuries. Then the tradition was assigned a single legendary founder. The pattern is becoming impossible to dismiss. Here is the reasonable objection. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Records from 2,500 years ago are fragmentary at best. Many real people left behind no documentation whatsoever. That is a fair position, and I take it seriously. But here is precisely where the objection starts to crack. We are not looking at one missing record. We are looking at a recurring structure. In every case, an institution needed a founding genius. In every case, the evidence points toward collective development rather than individual creation. In every case, the figure's biography is riddled with contradictions, supernatural embellishments, or a complete absence from any contemporary source. And in every case, questioning the attribution is treated not as scholarship but as heresy. One missing record is a historical gap. 6 identical gaps forming the same shape across completely unrelated civilizations is something else entirely. That something becomes impossible to dismiss with Lycurgus. You likely haven't heard of him, most people haven't. But his case strips away every remaining excuse and leaves the mechanism completely exposed. Lycurgus was supposedly the sole founder of Spartan law, the single genius who engineered the most militarized society the ancient world ever produced. The legal architecture that made Sparta into Sparta. Except the Spartans did not record their own history. They simply did not write things down. Everything we know about Lycurgus comes from outsiders writing centuries later, Herodotus, Xenophon, Plutarch. And their accounts contradict each other on virtually every detail. Different sources place him in different centuries. They assign him to different royal bloodlines. They cannot agree on how he died, self-starvation, exile, and peaceful retirement are all proposed. Plutarch himself openly admitted that nothing about Lycurgus the lawgiver can be stated with certainty. His biography includes a visit to the oracle at Delphi and divine approval of his legal code. The reforms themselves are historically real, nobody disputes their existence. The question is whether one man authored them, or whether Lycurgus was simply the name Spartans retroactively assigned to a process that evolved organically over generations. A legal system so extreme it demanded every boy be torn from his family at age 7 required divine authorization. It needed a founder who was more God than man. Because you cannot challenge a god's laws. You can always challenge a committee's decisions. What crystallized for me while researching Lycurgus was this: the purpose of the phantom genius is not to record history. It is to prevent history from being questioned. A system attributed to one divinely inspired lawmaker becomes untouchable. The identical system attributed to centuries of trial and error becomes debatable. The manufactured genius does not illuminate the past. It shields the present from scrutiny. And that realization leads directly to Shakespeare. This is not ancient fog. This is the 1500s. We have extensive documentation from this era. And yet the evidence supporting Shakespeare as the actual author of his plays is thinner than most people realize. In 1785, English scholar James Wilmot spent years methodically searching Stratford-upon-Avon for proof that Shakespeare was a writer. He found nothing. No manuscripts. No personal papers. No books the man owned. 240 years later, nothing has changed. Not a single original manuscript in Shakespeare's handwriting connects him to any of the plays. 6 signatures survive. They are inconsistent in spelling and appear painfully labored. The plays themselves demonstrate deep fluency in law, medicine, multiple foreign languages, precise Italian geography, and the intimate customs of aristocratic life. Shakespeare's documented education consisted of a grammar school in a provincial market town. There is a 7-year gap in the historical record, 1585 to 1592, where no documentation of his life exists at all. More than 80 alternative authorship candidates have been formally proposed. The late Justice John Paul Stevens of the United States Supreme Court stated publicly that he believed the evidence against Shakespeare's authorship was sufficient to meet the standard of reasonable doubt. When confronted with this, Professor Stanley Wells, one of the foremost Shakespeare scholars alive, responded in 2011 by calling it immoral to question the attribution. Not incorrect. Not unsupported by evidence. Immoral. That single word reveals more about institutional authority than any amount of literary analysis ever could. I want to be transparent about the final 2 figures. I spent considerable time deciding whether to include them. The cases are measurably weaker. The counterarguments are stronger. Charlemagne almost certainly existed as a real person. Solomon's absence from the archaeological record may simply reflect how little survives from the 10th century BC. I am not presenting these as direct equivalents to Pythagoras or Sun Tzu. But the reason I cannot omit them is specific: it is the mechanism itself. In 1986, an international archaeological conference in Munich formally addressed the well-documented problem: widespread document forgery by the medieval Catholic Church. Horst Fuhrmann, president of the Monumenta Germani Historica, confirmed the scale of it publicly. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the scholarly consensus. The Church forged documents routinely and systematically. In 1991, German historian Herbert Illig built upon this foundation and proposed the phantom time hypothesis, arguing that 297 years of history were essentially fabricated. His specific theory has been largely debunked. Tree ring data, Chinese records, Islamic chronicles, and astronomical observations from the same period all contradict it. But the institutional forgery he pointed toward is real. The deliberate manufacturing of historical authority through falsified documentation was institutionally sanctioned behavior. That is not a fringe theory. That is established history. The question is not whether institutions forged documents. They did. The question is how far the practice extended. Solomon presents a mirror image problem. The Bible describes him as the wisest and most prosperous king the ancient Near East ever produced. A vast unified kingdom. International trade networks. A temple so magnificent it became the defining architectural achievement of its age. And yet neighboring civilizations, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, civilizations that recorded everything, make no mention of Solomon or his kingdom at the scale the biblical account describes. Decades of systematic archaeological excavation in Jerusalem have uncovered no monumental construction from the 10th century BC matching the biblical narrative. The temple that supposedly defined an entire era has left zero physical trace. In 2001, Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University and Neil Asher Silberman argued in The Bible Unearthed that the united monarchy of David and Solomon is largely a political myth, constructed not during Solomon's supposed era, but centuries later, during the late monarchic period, when the kingdom of Judah needed a glorious past to legitimize its present authority. A struggling kingdom needed a magnificent origin story. So it constructed one retroactively, the wisest king, the grandest temple, the wealthiest era, all engineered to make the present feel like the continuation of something divinely ordained. 7 figures. 7 institutions. A cult, a civilization, a military tradition, a city-state, a literary establishment, a church, a kingdom. In every single case, the same structure, collective achievement compressed into a single name, gradual development repackaged as individual genius. And in every case, the manufactured figure performs the same function. It makes the institution's authority feel inevitable rather than constructed, natural rather than negotiated, divine rather than political. What I find hardest to sit with is this. We are taught history as an unbroken parade of extraordinary individuals, one solitary genius after another bending the world to their will. But what if that framing is itself the product of deliberate institutional manufacturing? What if the default mode of human progress is not individual genius but collective development, and the lone individuals are inserted afterward to make the story easier to control and harder to challenge? Every culture does this. Every institution does this. The mechanism has been documented at Munich conferences, confirmed in archaeological findings, and traced through linguistic analyses spanning centuries. It is not hidden. It is not secret. It is simply never discussed alongside the famous names it produced. You learned the Pythagorean theorem from a man who never wrote a single word. You studied the Odyssey under a name that 7 cities claimed and none could verify. You read The Art of War as the singular work of a strategist whose name appears in no text from his own lifetime. You accepted Spartan law as the design of one inspired lawgiver whose own biographers couldn't agree on when he lived or how he died. The question was never really whether these 7 figures existed. The question is what else was manufactured using the exact same blueprint, and whether any of us would even recognize it if we were staring directly at it right now. Because the uncomfortable truth about a blueprint is that it works best when no one knows it's being used. That is what stays with me. Not what was lost. What we were handed instead, and told never to examine.